Samryong the Mute, Nother Dohyang. I was about 10 years old at the time, so this story happened about 14 or 15 years ago from now. Nowadays, that place is called Cheongyupjeong, but back then it was called Yeonhwabong. In other words, if you look straight down from Namdaemun, there is a mountain ridge where Ojeongpo is located, and that mountain ridge is Yeonhwabong, and the neighborhood there is also Yeonhwabong. Nowadays, the place has turned into a filthy village that can only be called a slum, inhabited solely by laborers, but back then there were affluent people in their own eyes. There were only about a dozen houses, and the people living there mostly made a living by cultivating fields or planting vegetables, or else they grew bean sprouts to get by. There was one person among them who owned a large plot of land and lived a comfortable life. Although I have forgotten his name, the villagers called him Oh Sangwon. With a plump and handsome face, his voice rumbled like a cicada perched on a catalpa tree in the summer, chirping endlessly. He was an extremely diligent elderly man, always bustling about from dawn, holding his two hands behind the back, taking care of household. In the neighborhood, he was like a clock, so the villagers woke up according to his schedule. If by chance he didn't go about his morning routine and nagging, the villagers would find it odd and upon visiting his house would discover that he was inevitably bedridden due to illness. However, such occasions were rare, occurring perhaps once in 365 days, or even less frequently, once every 3 years. Although he hadn't been living here for long, as he always wore a gamtu, traditional Korean hat commonly worn by Korean noblemen whenever he went out, the villagers called him a yangbon, Korean nobleman. He, too, endeavored not to lose the favor of the villagers, often sharing dried pollack and providing an ample supply of farming tools for the villagers to use whenever they needed. Consequently, his house was the most respected and influential in the neighborhood, and he was highly regarded for his kindness and generosity. In that house, there was a mute servant named Samryong, whose stature was naturally small. It seemed as if his head was directly attached to his body due to his short neck. Additionally, his face was heavily wrinkled and his mouth was large. Despite having previously shaved his head at the master's command, it seemed to grow back and stretched out like the thorns of a chestnut. When he walked, he appeared short of breath and slow, resembling a frog standing and moving around. The villagers had no particular name for him, often just calling out mute or mute pride, or sometimes dumb. But Samryong didn't know these sounds. He, too, was brought here by the master when they moved, and he is truthful, loyal, diligent, and meticulous. Although he communicates only through gestures, he is wiser than he appears, and he has never made a mistake in his life due to his cautious nature. In the morning, he sweeps the yard, feeds the cows and pigs, pulls weeds in the fields during the summer, gathers firewood, and runs errands in the winter. There is nothing he cannot do, whether it's a job in the fields or a domestic task. Yet, despite all this, the master of the house cares for and loves the mute servant. If there is any sign of discomfort in his body, he is allowed to rest. Whatever he seems to desire, he is fed, clothed when necessary, and put to bed. However, in this household, the descendants were scarce, and only one son was born, continuing the lineage for 3 generations. Oh Sangwon had a son who is the 3rd generation to inherit the household. Although he is 17 years old, he still looks no older than 14. And because he is so adorably pampered, he lacks discipline and often behaves recklessly, displaying cruelty towards both people and animals alike. The villagers would often curse, saying, "Those useless kids always causing trouble for their parents. It's better not to have such a son." So whenever the son misbehaved, his mother would look to his father for inspiration, urging, "You should give him a good spanking. Why do you just stand there and watch?" If she stepped forward to do it herself, he would kindly interject, "No, he's still young and immature. He'll grow out of it." Then his wife would scold him, raising her voice like a madwoman. "Immature? How old is he now? He'll turn 20 in a few days, and soon he'll be married and have children of his own. What are you talking about?" She would go on, "It's all because you spoiled him rotten. You only saw how cute he was and didn't bother to teach him any manners." Whenever such arguments began to escalate, the father would remain silent and simply walk away. Moreover, the son doesn't even acknowledge the mute servant as a fellow human being. He ridicules the mute by calling him speechless and occasionally resorts to physical violence, hitting him with his fists or kicking him with his feet. In response, the mute considers the boy to be simply young and inexperienced. He finds it somewhat endearing that the son behaves in such a way, or he views it with a mixture of amusement and pity when the son tries to interact with his sturdy body using his own weak arms and legs. The mute then turns away and shifts his body elsewhere to avoid any further conflict. There were times when the boy would even force feces into the mouth of the sleeping mute, and sometimes he would gently tie up the sleeping mute's arms and legs and place hot coals between his fingers and toes, delighting in watching him squirm and writhe in agony, as if he were a dying man. Each time, the mute's heart was filled with a sense of bitter resentment. However, rather than resenting the master's son, he resented himself for being disabled, and instead of cursing the master's son, he cursed the world itself. Yet, he never shed a tear. His tears, like water from a dried-up spring, tried to come out but could not. He remained like a faithful dog that knew no other place but here, believing that this was where he belonged and that the people here were the only ones he could trust. He knew nothing beyond living and dying here. It was his destiny. Even if his master's son beat, struck, pinched, and tortured him in every possible way, he knew it would always be this way for him. He understood that pain would always come back to him and that he must endure it. He never once pondered how to avoid what he rightfully deserved. When the master's son struck him, he knew he had enough strength to fend him off. Sometimes, when pain and bitterness seeped into his body, his fists would tremble as if to strike the young master, but he tightly restrained himself, enduring both the urge and the excruciating agony. Internally, he would say to himself, "No, he's my master's son. He's my young master," gritting his teeth as he forcefully pushed aside those thoughts, banishing them from his mind. Yet, if the master's son ever returned home in tears after being teased by neighborhood children, the mute would fiercely defend him, engaging in a fight on his behalf. Consequently, even the mischievous children in the neighborhood were afraid to confront the mute. In times of dire need, the master's son always sought him out. Despite enduring blows, the mute never hesitated to exert his utmost strength for his master's son, submissive like a loyal hound. Until he turned 23, he had never interacted with women or engaged in meaningful conversations. Occasionally, local girls teased him with gestures and antics, leaving him frustrated yet never experiencing love or showing affection towards any woman. However, even the mute, a person with carnal desires, did not have cold blood. Perhaps his blood was even hotter. It was impossible to ascertain. It could have been as hot as boiling syrup, for all one could tell. If he were exposed to the sun or subjected to intense heat again, it was uncertain whether his blood would melt once more. Late into the night, sitting beneath the flickering oil lamp, lost in deep contemplation, he would let out unnoticed sighs. Resigned to forsaking carnal desires, he suppressed them with great effort. Like a dormant volcano harboring deep-seated passions within his chest, the mute concealed fervor, uncertain of when it might erupt. He sensed the ominous turbulence signaling an imminent explosion, but found it challenging to meet the conditions necessary for such an eruption. External pressures hindered his ability to express these passions actively, paradoxically empowering him with self-control and leading him to resign himself to inaction. Internally, he pondered, "I am mute." This acknowledgement brought deep-seated frustration, perceiving a disparity in freedom and rights compared to those who could speak. Despite this awareness, he couldn't accept his circumstances, resigning himself to this fate. Like a mere cog in a machine, he found himself enslaved within this household, feeling there was no world beyond it. It was autumn of that year when the master's son got married. Seisei, the bride, was 2 years older than the groom at 19. The master lamented his shallow lineage and sought a bride from a family with high social status, but struggled to find a suitable match. He reluctantly arranged the engagement ceremony with a widow from a neighboring village, offering money to marry off his son to the daughter of impoverished nobles to avoid gossip. The wedding cost 30,000 nyang at the time, plus 2,500 nang per month for sewing and laundry expenses to the daughter-in-law's family. The bride, until her father's passing, managed well, raised in an old-fashioned household where she learned and read everything, showing flawless character and demeanor. When the bride arrived, the groom's flaws began to surface. He's like a crow facing a heron compared to his bride. He still acts like a child. He'll be bossed around by his wife. She's too good for him. When gossiping housewives gathered, they critiqued him. Occasionally, wives skilled in meddling confronted their husbands. Well, now that you're a grown man, you should act like one. How can you have a wife if you don't? You should be ashamed of yourself. They might continue to admonish in such a manner. On such occasions, the groom resented those who spoke such words, feeling they deliberately shamed him. He wouldn't speak to or acknowledge them afterwards. When his aunt came and saw him, she said, "Now you're a grown man. Haven't you had enough of this? Aren't you ashamed of your behavior towards your wife?" Each time, his heart filled with more resentment towards his wife, making him feel this way rather than towards the speaker. What kind of wife is she? The darn woman comes in and makes my life miserable. Just a few days after the wedding, he refused to enter the bridal chamber. Chaos ensued in the household, attempting to force him into the chamber as if trying to corral a pig or foal. During these attempts, he retaliated fiercely, once even drawing blood from his cousin's forehead. The household members finally pushed the matter to the father as a last resort. But even that proved futile, and only stirred up more trouble. Upon receiving a scolding from his father and returning inside, he grabbed the bride by her hair and beat her on the outside wooden floor in a fit of rage. He then commanded her, "Get out of my sight and go back to your home. I can't stand the sight of you." When food was brought to him, he would push the table away onto the courtyard, and when clothes were given to him, he would throw them into the trash. Thus, from the day she arrived as a bride, she lamented her fate and became a person who cried day and night. She would be beaten for crying, and if she remained silent, she would be hit for being unresponsive. Consequently, there was never a peaceful day in that household. Among those who witnessed this daily ordeal, there was one who harbored an inexplicable suspicion, and that was none other than the mute servant, Samryong. In his eyes, the bride appeared as beautiful, gentle, and docile as a fairy, and the thought of anyone daring to lay a hand on her filled him with indescribable doubt. To mistreat a woman who appeared so enchanting and sublime to the eye seemed utterly inconceivable. While he believed it was only fitting for himself, a mute servant, to endure mistreatment akin to that of a dog or pig from his master, the idea of the gentle and distinguished bride, with a disparity as vast as that between a fairy and a beast, enduring such treatment was too horrifying to bear. He even feared that his young master might face divine retribution. On a certain moonlit night, when the surroundings were quiet and the stars twinkled sparsely, with the half-moon hanging clearly in the sky, as if it had meticulously cleaned the world with its mercury-like light, Samryong, while stroking a black dog, lay sprawled on a straw mat in the courtyard, gazing up at the sky, lost in thought. When he thought of his little master's bride, she seemed more beautiful and pure than the moon in the sky, and brighter than the stars. Thinking of her, he could see the moon and the stars. Her beauty and gentleness seemed to surpass the radiance of the silver moonlight or the glittering stars that cleanse the entire universe. It was as if the moon and stars had descended to earth to become his little madam, or if she ascended to the heavens, she would become the moon and the stars themselves. Moreover, when he recalled the pity and compassion that his female master showed him, despite being unable to speak up when his young master mistreated him, he felt moved. He would gently stroke the back of the dog, feeling touched as it wagged its tail, seemingly thinking he was endearing and licking his hand. Samryong's heart brimmed with empathy for his young mistress. He was overflowing with determination to spare no effort, even if it meant sacrificing his own life for her sake. It was an instinctive emotion, akin to salivating at the sight of an apricot. After the arrival of the new mistress, while others were restricted in their movements, Samryong could come and go freely, almost like a dog allowed to enter and leave at will without any suspicion. One day, the young master got heavily drunk on the liquor he usually avoided, was beaten by someone unknown, and fell on the road. He was then carried inside by Samryong. At that time, nobody was inside except the mistress, who was sewing alone in her room. Upon witnessing this scene, touched by the loyal heart of the mute, she later gave him a purse made of a piece of silk she had been using. This act did not go unnoticed by the young master. Hence, one night while sleeping, his wife was dragged to the courtyard with her hair loose, and she was beaten until blood covered her entire body. Witnessing this, the mute's sense of determination surged once again. Like a possessed lion, he rushed in, threw the young master out, and surrounded the young mistress protectively. Then, like a devoted dog, he ran to the place where the beloved old master resided outside and laid her down before him, gesturing and moving his body repeatedly to convey his grievances. The next morning, he was severely beaten by the young master with a stick, causing one side of his face to swell and bleed, his eye nearly swollen shut. When struck, the master exclaimed, "You wretched mute! How dare you touch my wife?" He snatched the silk purse, tore it into shreds, and threw it into the back room. "And you? Now you dare strike your master without recognizing him? Such a creature deserves to die," he said, whipping his back until he collapsed on the spot. The mute could only plead with his hands. Unable to speak, he bowed his head countless times until his nose touched the ground, begging for forgiveness. However, a sense of justice that had long been buried in his heart began to resurface. He endured the pain while suppressing his boiling anger. From then on, the mute was forbidden from entering the inner chamber. This prohibition only fueled his curiosity further. This curiosity gradually transformed into a longing to see the young mistress again, a longing so intense that it burned in his chest. The melancholic emotions overwhelmed him. At times, he felt a longing so intense that he wished he could see the mistress even once. This sentiment gradually consumed his thoughts. Amidst this sentimentality, he experienced a profound emotion akin to ecstasy, as if it were the very essence of life. He felt as though he could exchange it for his own life. Sometimes he resisted the urge to break through barriers just to catch a glimpse of the mistress, suppressing his desire deep within. Afterward, he found it difficult to eat well. Work slipped from his grasp, and he couldn't focus on anything. He longed to retreat indoors at every opportunity, consumed by the desire to be inside. Despite the old master providing him with more sustenance and comfort than previously, he couldn't endure it. The increased provisions brought him no comfort. Instead, he wandered the house's periphery at night, unable to find solace. On one occasion, the young master returned home heavily intoxicated, observing the house buzzing with activity and the maid heading out to buy medicine. He grabbed the maid, demanding an explanation. The maid communicated with gestures, tapping the back of her head and stroking her face to signify youthfulness and beauty, extending her index finger to represent the young master. She then stuck out her tongue, rolled her eyes, stretched her arms, and collapsed backward, indicating illness or impending death. The mute, startled, approached the maid slowly, visibly taken aback. His heart raced with fear. Was his beloved mistress dead or dying? He sighed deeply, fists clenched, spending hours lost in thought in his room. As the night deepened, his curiosity overwhelmed him. He alternated between standing and sitting until around 2 a.m, when he cautiously ventured outside, circling back cautiously. He stood before the stone fence behind the neighboring room's closed door, acting like a thief, hesitating before finally climbing over the low wall. Standing near the window, he peered inside through the gap in the door, trembling with apprehension before retreating. On a dark night, his hands and feet trembling like leaves in the wind, he pushed open the door and dashed inside. At that moment, the mistress's arm, holding a long linen cloth, met his. She used her other hand to push against his chest. The mute widened his eyes in surprise, emitting only a grunt as he struggled to snatch away the cloth. The household erupted into chaos. It seems the household is ruined. Did the mute and the mistress really attempt something illicit? Is that true? Whatever it is, it's an inexplicable situation, murmured voices. The next morning, the mute lay sprawled in the yard, writhing in pain and vomiting blood from his mouth. Beside him, the young master wielded a cudgel. "This scoundrel!" he exclaimed, mimicking obscene gestures as he pointed toward the room. The mute shook his hands to deny the accusation, blood staining the cudgel. With a choking throat, the mute gestured weakly. He collapsed, pressing his forehead against the ground, blood seeping into the earth around him. The young master attached a lead weight to the end of his whip, striking the mute's chest before pulling it away. The mute fell silent, collapsing without a word. Still unsatisfied, the young master grabbed the sickle the mute had sharpened the previous day and lunged forward, raising it high in the piercing sunlight. But as he attempted to strike, the mute intercepted with his arm and household members rushed in. The sickle flew away into the distance. The old master, declaring the household had fallen to ruin, remained in his room, refusing to come out despite hearing everything. Others accused the young mistress of causing trouble in the household. That evening, the mute was dragged out once more. This time, the young master handed him his worn-out clothes and belongings, pointing into the distance with wide-open eyes. "Go! You can no longer stay in our house," he commanded. Upon hearing this, the mute was stunned. Besides this house, he had nowhere else to go. He had no place to live. He had always known that he would live and die in this house. He clung to the young master's leg, pleading desperately with gestures and expressions, unable to speak. But the master kicked him away and called for someone. "Get rid of this wretch." The mute left as if he were abandoned, dragging his feet. He stumbled out, leaning against the fence post, then collapsed, only to rise again and try to come back in. But by then, the door was already shut. He pounded on it, his heart yearning for his old master, but he couldn't call out. The door, which he used to open and close every day, now remained open, yet it rejected him, refusing to let him in. Everything he had worked for, all his dedication and loyalty, meant nothing now. He finally realized that everything he trusted and hoped for had turned against him. He understood that it was better to destroy everything, including himself, rather than continuing to exist in such a state. The evening was deep, with only the distant sounds of roosters crowing and dogs barking echoing in the air. Suddenly, an unexpected blaze engulfed the house where the mute once lived. As if the fire had been deliberately prepared in advance, the surrounding grasses caught fire, illuminating the outline of the house vividly as it burned. The fire consumed the house with intensity, devouring it swiftly. Amidst the chaos, one figure leapt into the inferno, Samryong, who had been expelled from the house earlier that day. Unaware of the impending danger, he rushed into the house, breaking down the door, and then carried the master out, laying him in the center of the field. Unmindful of his own fate, he tried to re-enter the burning building, unaware of the danger, his face, back, and legs turning to ash. He rushed into the neighboring room, but the mistress was nowhere to be found. He dashed into the main room again, but she was still absent, and the young master clung to his arm, pleading for salvation. Yet he brushed him aside. Once more, a burning rafter fell onto his head, but he remained unaware. He ventured into the kitchen, where a falling door latch broke his left arm, yet he remained oblivious. Returning to the hallway, he found no one. Then, he entered the neighboring room once more. It was then that he saw the mistress lying beneath a quilt, seemingly prepared to be consumed by the flames. He embraced her, and then found his way. However, there was nowhere to escape. With no other choice, he climbed onto the roof. It was only then that he realized his body was not his own to control. Yet, he also realized a sensation he had never experienced before, a strange pleasure coursing through his chest as he held the mistress close. Embracing her, he felt alive for the first time. When he thought his life was already over, when he set the woman down, his life had already ended. The house was completely engulfed in flames, and the mute had her placed on his lap. Did his resentment disappear along with the fire? Only a faint smile of peace and happiness appeared at the corners of his mouth. Originally published in 1929,